Welcome everybody to episode 11, I think we are on now, of St. Joseph's Workshop. And it's the first one with a full boat. We got all four of us here in the house, Alan, Jason, Mark, and myself. And we're coming at you today because we want to talk about something that's being discussed more and more and more kind of in the political sphere, and that's the idea of you know, political migration, people, especially here in the United States, people moving from one state to another kind of as a reflection of their values. You hear about a lot of conservatives moving from blue states like New York and California to either Texas or Florida, or sometimes it's the reverse. You have people, liberals, wanting to leave blue states or red states to get to blue states like California because they're more permissive of the values that they enjoy. So anyway, what we want to discuss today is what kind of responsibility do we as men hold for ourselves and for our loved ones, the people that we're responsible for, um, to place them in an environment that best reflects our values as Catholics. So one of the big, the pressing issue here today is now a week after the the draft of the SCOTUS decision about Roe v. Wade possibly being overruled, has prompted a lot of discussion about political migration, both for pro-abortion people who would want to go leave the states where they're likely to outlaw abortion and go to states where abortion would be permitted, and vice versa. Those of us who are anti-abortion would want to theoretically leave the states that are going to fund abortion, likely for the entire term of the pregnancy and possibly even after the pregnancy, according to some proposed legislation. Um, and we'd want to get out of those states so we're no longer paying taxes into something like that and go to states that would outlaw abortion. So these are different places that their policies reflect different sets of values, and those things are theoretically going to polarize the more that issues like abortion become, prominent, with the Roe decision. So today we're going to discuss that. We have some content from the Catechism and stuff that we want to discuss. And so, Jason, I think you're leading us off with the passage out of the Catechism. Is that right?
Alan is.
I will
Alan,
be doing it.
right?
Okay, so as a pretext, we were discussing about we're to start off with abortion. I think instead of us talking about what we feel or think, it's best if we go to the Catechism, see what the Catechism teaches. And so I've got a bit here to read, but it looks like, and I don't know if these are called articles, but it looks like we have about 5 different articles on abortion in the Catechism. They're all in Part 3. So I'll read here's item or Article 2270, which reads, human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. From the first moment of his existence, a human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent being to life. And then we have some Bible quotes, which is found throughout, which is here. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. And then my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately wrought in the depths of the earth. Now, and I see it's not all Bible, it's from different sources, but you can look that up in your own catechism in your own time. Okay, and here's Article 2271. Since the first century of the church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion, this teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to moral law. And then the other 2 quotes. We'll go on to Article 2272, which says, formal cooperation in an abortion constitutes a grave offense. The Church attaches the canonical penalty of excommunication to this crime against human life. Quote, a person who procures a completed abortion incurs excommunication late sententiae, end quote, by the very commission of the offense, and subject to the conditions provided by canon law. The Church does not thereby intend to restrict the scope of mercy. Rather, she makes clear the gravity of the crime committed, the irreparable harm done to the innocent who is put to death, as well as to the parents and the whole of society. Article 2273, the inalienable right to life of every human individual is a constitutive element of a civil society and its legislation. And then there are two large quotes. 2274, since it must be treated from conception as a person, the embryo must be defended in its integrity, cared for, and healed as far as possible, like any other human being. Prenatal diagnosis is morally licit. Quote, if it respects the life and integrity of the embryo and the human fetus and is directed towards its safeguarding or healing as an individual, it is gravely opposed to the moral law when this is done with the thought of possibly inducing an abortion. Depending upon the results, a diagnosis must not be the equivalent of a death sentence. And then 2275, one must hold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo, which respect the life and integrity of the embryo and do not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its condition of health, or its individual survival. Quote, it is immoral to produce human embryos intended for exploitation as disposable biological material. Second quote, certain attempts to influence chromosomatic or genetic inheritance are not therapeutic, but are aimed at producing human beings selected according to sex or other predetermined qualities. Such manipulations are contrary to the personal dignity of the human being and his integrity and identity, which are unique and unrepeatable. And seeing the importance of these quotes, I'm going to go back to 2273, read those two quotes, which one says, the inalienable rights of the person must be recognized and respected by civil society and the political authority. These human rights depend neither on single individuals nor on parents, nor do they represent a concession made by society and the state. They belong to human nature and are inherent in the person by virtue of the creative act from which the person took his origin. Among such fundamental rights, one should mention in this regard every human being's right to life and the physical integrity from the moment of conception until death. And then the last quote, the moment a positive law deprives the category of human beings of the protection which civil legislation ought to accord them, the state is denying the equality of all before the law. When the state does not place its power at the service of the rights of each citizen, and in particular of the more vulnerable, the very foundations of a state based on law are undermined. As a consequence of the respect and protection which must be ensured for the unborn child from the moment of conception, the law must provide appropriate penal sanctions for every deliberate violation of the child's rights. End quote. Okay, so that those lengthy articles are where the Catechism is regarding abortion.
Mhm. So that very clearly seems to establish that abortion is a grave moral evil, and so the Supreme Court would be just in overturning that law. I think we all
Yeah,
agree.
and I think I just want to make our listeners aware that we did read some of the op-ed from that or the opinion of the court from Alito, and he clearly states that this was never a law. It's not a law. It's not federal law. It's what it did was take away the rights of the states unconstitutionally to create laws for or against abortion. Congress has never passed a federal law that allows abortion. So the Supreme Court in the 70s illegally created a law called Roe v. Wade, or a decision, and made it law and took the rights away from the states. So this is, first of all, the foundation of how the Supreme Court can and will overturn a law that really was never voted upon by Congress and signed by a president, because that's how laws in America are created, regardless of what current people in office try to tell you today. And your history teachers, for those who are in college or in high school. So that's why it could be turned, and then it brings it back to the states. And this is where we're the purpose of our podcast today is to say, okay, what do you do as a Catholic male with your either yourself or your family when you live in a state that you know is pro-choice, and pro-choice with capital bold letters and explanation points, where they're willing to murder a child even after the mother has given birth, and if the mother still doesn't want it, they could terminate the child, which is, we know, is murder. And I mean, we there's laws, but in the state of New York, the DAs don't carry out those laws, and so I guess it makes sense why New York would try to pass a law like this. So what do you do as a taxholder or a taxpayer with this, and what do you do as the Catholic Church in these states, right? So one of the things that I brought up earlier in our conversation prior to starting the podcast was, we're in the season of Easter, and the first reading every day is Acts, and the disciples were put in many spots that knew nothing about Christianity, knew nothing about who Jesus was, might have heard of it, and there was a lot going against the disciples to convert people to Christianity. And we have to pray and ask ourselves, are we the disciples who are going to go into areas and help change the mindset and convert people to Christianity, and as the disciples did in Acts? And what I mean by that, do we change them to not just Christianity, but and we don't have to convert anybody, but convert their moral compass to respect life? Maybe that's what we need to do, rather than maybe go to a state that we're more comfortable. And that's just food for thought. I don't know how you guys feel about that. Because the sins of the politicians are not our sins. The example I gave was, I just got married a couple weeks ago. Alan and Andrew were at my wedding. They gave me a gift. Now, what I do with that with my wife, which we would never do, but if we did something immoral with it, we chose to do that with our money. And Andrew and Alan did not choose that to do with the money they gave us. So there is no sin committed by them. The sin is committed by me and my wife by using that money for an immoral, unethical reason, whatever it is. Give donations to a pro-choice candidate or pro-choice organization, right? For us as Catholics, that's immoral and unethical, because we're, as the Catechism said, we are participating in the act of the abortion. We're not defending life, right? So, that's one way we could think about it, because sometimes circumstances don't allow us to move. We may not have the financial means. This is where our job is, and we may not be able to find a job in a more pro-life state, right? So how do we then work with what God has given us, and the will that God has given us, and the task that He's given us? So I'm going to pause there, and you guys feel free to chime in and discuss that.
Well, and I don't want to jump on it right away, but one thing that you had said is what we know, and I'm not too sure where it is and what I know, but like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, based on page 5 of my catechism here. This one is approved by John Paul II in 1992. No, it says the Pope declares that the Catechism is a statement of the Church's faith in Catholic doctrine, attested to or illuminated by sacred scripture, the apostolic tradition, and the Church's magisterium. And it goes on. And I think that more so than knowing, in an intellectual sense, there's also a sense of belief. And we're not really coming to this necessarily from the point of view of canon lawyers or medical professionals in any way, but simply as Catholics, and we hold these things to be true. And one of the ways that we can delineate that is through the Catechism, and so it helps synthesize the magisterium, 2,000 years effectively of Christian thought. And it's also a benefit to having something like this, is we don't have to figure everything out all at once on our own, which would be quite the undertaking, since it's taken the Western world about 2,000 years to put this together. And so I think from a faith perspective more than a knowledge perspective, I think there's a great gift in having something like the magisterium that helps us understand these complicated issues without going down a rabbit hole of trying to understand scientific information if we're not scientifically minded or formed, or legal issues if we're not legally capable or prepared or whatever. No. And so from an article of faith, I think we hold the sanctity of human life to be of primary importance. And I think the Catechism helps underline some of these things. Andrew, are you going to say something?
I lost my train of thought. Shoot.
This happens when I jumped right in. No, what Jason was saying is true, which is that the culpability is a big issue, and the state or the government or something like that, even though we're paying taxes that end up there, they also end up to trimming the grass on 995, I'm sure. So it's it's hard to say where each and every dollar goes or what our culpability is with it.
Yeah, and another thing with that is you gotta, so we have to be careful where we get up and we move. And let's just say we move to Florida, right? And we move to Florida, and DeSantis runs for office, he gets elected, and then somehow, some way, you get a moderate Democrat in Florida. You're gonna get up and he's pro life. You're gonna get up and leave Florida again, and then because really you're talking deep South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Oklahoma. I mean, that's where you're gonna find where there's Wyoming, that it ain't ever gonna go blue. And if it does, then we've lost all hope in society in our country.
Yeah.
So you kind of at a Tennessee, but so that's two. Do we just keep moving around? Until we find this utopia that really may not exist, and maybe God wants you to be in a certain spot because he has something that he needs you to do to fix these types of immoral things in said state. And it may look like, in New York and California, it may look like a huge uphill battle, and it is, but not everybody has the means to get up and go, or the employment opportunity to get up and go. So that
what would you say to someone who did have the means, let's just say someone is able to work remote in their job, because we saw this a lot in the early months of the pandemic. There were a lot of news stories about companies are deciding that their employees can work remote forever, like they don't have to come back. And there was even talk about Twitter selling off office space in San Francisco because all of they just decided all their employees can work from home now forever. So a lot of those people were moving out of the Bay Area. They were going to places like Lake Tahoe or even further out because they're like, shoot, I can work from wherever I want now. So if that is kind of your MO, or your motivation, if you can really choose to work from wherever you want because all you need is an internet connection, and then you choose to go someplace as a Catholic that is grossly pro-abortion, Alan, you mentioned, or Jason, I think it was, you mentioned earlier that there's some states that are considering legislation that would allow for postnatal abortion, and
Right, and Congress tried to pass that today, the Senate,
yeah.
and it mailed
It's
favorably.
incredible.
Thank
Did
God.
they say how far ahead? Like up to your maybe
They
age
were
40?
in the third trimester. They
Incredible.
were. I mean, it was just straight up murder what they
Yeah.
were trying to pass.
Yeah.
For our listeners out there, one of the state legislations that's being considered right now, California, it's Assembly Bill AB 2223, and as originally written, there was a provision that would allow for that would basically decriminalize the infant's death after after birth up to 28 days.
28. So they can have a 1-month-old.
Yep.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. Now there was some obvious upheaval about that, and supposedly that provision was removed from the bill, but it still provides
Right.
for.
There's somebody out there that has that mindset.
Yeah, and that could have just been a little bit of brinkmanship, a little bit of kind of testing the waters, like how much of a
Right.
we're going to get, because maybe they want to
How
back in down
right
the
where right.
line.
How far
I
can we
think it's
push?
when you have those proposals out there. I mean, and people say, well, that critics of that may say, well, that's extreme case that won't become law. But the fact that it's out there, and the fact that we do have laws on the books, even with like late term abortion. Yeah, sure, the majority of abortions aren't happening in 8-9 months. That's a fact. That's not really a serious problem. But there are places where you can do that. So in principle, very bad law. And so you see more people propose very bad laws. And yeah, it's concerning about where things could go.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right.
Yeah, and I think, Drew, to your question, I mean, it's what you choose to do, right? If you discern and you feel like this is where God wants you to go, then and that's what God's telling you to do, and you've discerned it, and you've talked about it with whoever significant, your husband, your wife, whatever, who's ever trying to make the decision, the kids, and like all of that, and everybody is in agreement and feeling like this is where God is calling me, then that's what you choose to do, right? We all have free will. Again, I could tell you probably 98% of our tax dollars don't go to anything that they tell you it's supposed to go to. We could be funding child sex trafficking for all we know. We probably are. Look at the border.
Well,
you know what I mean? Like, you don't know where your money's going, even in a so-called good state.
When you think about just, I don't know, typical like day-to-day life, how the products we use, may be backed by organizations that we're opposed to, like Planned Parenthood. So you wonder where your money's going when you pay for things. But like, yeah, there must be, I think, Drew, your point was that when we talk about abortion, this serious, grave, immoral action. And so, yes, I may be living my life, and I have an iPhone, and the parts came from some mine where maybe there was child slave labor. I don't know. I mean, but yeah, when it comes to the issue of abortion, if you can do whatever you can to avoid it, the problem is that many states, the money is tangled up in this sort of thing.
Right.
Even in red states. I mean, I think there's the Hyde Amendment, which keeps taxpayer dollars out of abortion in theory, like still doesn't have exceptions for like rape and incest. And as Catholics, we're opposed to abortion.
That's true. There's a lot of red states that say like, oh, we're outlawing abortion except in these cases of rape.
That's
right. And by the way, what is kind of hilarious is with the Mississippi law, it permits an abortion up to 15 weeks. It's your first trimester.
Yeah.
Okay. So you still, after 3 months, unfortunately, could murder a child in the state of Mississippi. And that's one of the most reddest states, if not the reddest states in the entire union. They're still singing Dixie down there. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and that was blue a long, long time ago. So if you want to look that up in real history, please do, folks. And we could go talk about all of what that party has not voted for as it comes to freedoms for races and women and all of that. So I am not surprised that they have no value for children in a womb. As you're seeing on the southern border, no value in life down there either, where they're just letting children come in, and God knows where they're going, these poor children. So it doesn't shock me, right, that all this exists. But Mississippi, so we're talking about moving from a liberal state to a conservative state, but Mississippi still permits abortion after the first trimester, 15 weeks. So first trimester is 12 weeks, 3 months, and you have another 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Well,
so
under,
do you
under
move? So
Roe
your
v.
tax
Wade,
dollars
though,
are still paying for an abortion in the state of Mississippi.
but still, that shows you the state of where we are with this. I mean, that is one of the most pro-life proposals put out there.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, Roe said essentially you can't have abortion before, or states can't restrict abortion before 24 weeks, 23, 24 weeks, 22 weeks, the point of viability.
Right.
So, that's always been the case. So it is pretty radical, though, that Mississippi is out here saying, hey, 15 weeks,
Yeah.
Right.
So I think what
it's a step in the right direction, right? So we're reducing the amount of time you have to get an abortion,
Right.
Mississippi, and New York and California is decriminalizing murdering children. I mean, so you can see how, right? But to your point of moving to a state that is more pro-life, you're still, at the end of the day, your taxes, which are very minimal in Mississippi, are still going towards funding abortions up to 15 weeks.
Yeah.
So you're still not avoiding the your money going to something that you don't believe in. And that's why the whole, back to what, when Alan read the parts of the Catechism, the sins of these people are not your sins. And what you could do is you could pray, for mercy on them, that God gives them mercy, so that they understand, and the Holy Spirit comes and they understand that what they're doing is murder. It's just wrong, period. I don't want to get into the whole abortion thing and what you can and cannot do to prevent yourselves from having to make an abortion, right? I mean, we're all adults. So our license and birth certificate tells us we're adults because we're at a certain age, but it doesn't mean we always act like it. As we're seeing out in the protests and everything. But I mean, I really think this is it's a tough discussion or it's a tough decision to make about moving, whether you're single or married and with a family, based on things like abortion, or based on things that our faith tells us that is immoral, right? Because there isn't a state that is 100%, morally and ethically correct.
Yeah.
Right. So, there's always going to be something.
Kind of in response to what you were saying a minute ago about, Mississippi's arguably the most conservative state in the country, and yet their anti-abortion law would still restrict it after 15 weeks. I think it's worth noting, though, that this is all managed to come to pass with Roe still in effect. So without Roe, like we've done a couple stories recently about how if Roe is repealed, there are currently 13 states with trigger laws that would, like the very moment that Roe is repealed, these laws in these respective states would go into effect, basically outlawing abortion completely. So like the repeal of Roe completely changes the landscape, and therefore these states suddenly become very different, because now you can't get one at all, maybe in a place like Idaho or Oklahoma or something like that.
Okay, well then that's where, right, you're doing your research, right, and then that's where that becomes part of your discernment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that and also I think to really, if we're trying to say what should we do as men, right? Well, the first thing we could focus on and control as men is our home.
Mm-hmm.
what we teach in our home and how we act as men and fathers and husbands is the example that we need to live out every day in our home, and then secondly in our communities.
Mhm.
If we raise our children under a Catholic faith and our faith and teach them what is right and wrong and have a loving home, which we all know is difficult at times, and we all know we come from different backgrounds and everything isn't rosy all the time, and we get that. But when you have prayer in your home and you have a strong faith in your home, your kids, no matter where they are, will be protected from Satan and the evil and the immoral injustices that these left-leaning states roll out. Okay,
Hmm.
so that's the first and foremost, right? So rather than looking at the big picture of getting to step 10, let's get to step 1, and that's becoming a man and understanding what it means to be a man in the Catholic Church. And it doesn't mean we yell and scream and fight. We talk and we listen and we convey our faith and our message, like as Alan talked about with the Catechism, to those who may not agree with our moral compass, to help them realign their compass. And we keep our moral compass straight in our homes and lead by example. That's the first and foremost thing a man could do in states, in any state and in any country,
Right.
wherever you are. That's the
Well,
first
you
step
talk
you should
about
take.
our families, and it's like the family is called the ecclesiola, or the little church, and in the with the concept of subsidiarity in mind, it's like our first and foremost responsibility is to our families, to build our families, um, to and so and the man is the priest, prophet, and king of his family. So he has to consider those roles, both spiritual and temporal, of how to best protect, how to best uh, raise and educate not just his kids, but also his wife and any other family members that might be in his charge. And I think what the case that some people, not on this podcast, but there are other podcasters out there and authors and such, they make the case that the condition of society around us, of the culture, has gotten so far past the point of no return that it's like it's become almost an imperative, a moral imperative, to relocate oneself and your family to a more like-minded place, a place that you can be sure is not going to uh, pollute your family with moral garbage, either through entertainment or through education or just the public square. So I think that's kind of like the ultimate kind of bottom line of what we're discussing here right now today.
Well, there's a saying which is that if you want a perfect church, don't join it. And I think that it's best to, if people who want to say, oh, if I go off to the state, whatever, because they don't have this law, then everything will be Valhalla. And people bring themselves wherever they go, and I think that's a fool's mission, really. I think that you'll no sooner will you leave one imperfect place and you go to another imperfect place and you find its own imperfections.
Right.
I think that what you all are saying, Andrew and Jason, especially the idea of having one's family and living well. And I think that ultimately we're responsible for ourselves, right? Everyone's got to work out their own salvation. And the ideal place to do it is in the family, the small church, right? And there's also a discussion of authority in that, right? And so Catholic masculinity, according to Catholic thought, right? The male has a place of authority, not superiority, but there is a sense of of authority in the family. And that sort of mimics an authority that we see that in the church, right? The Pope has an authority, the bishops have authority, all of that, and this all recognizes that God's got an authority, right? Ultimately, God created man, and so on. And so, who's got the authority to end what God has created? Who's got the authority to end life? That's, I think, ultimately the rootedness of this. And I think that, anybody who has seen a 1-month-old child, it's hard for me to imagine that these same people would then wish to pursue legislation that would say that the parents or a guardian or some other being could then choose to arbitrarily or decisively end the life of this 1-month-old. That this 1-month-old doesn't have a right to continue living. They don't have a right to life, and it shows how problematic some people's view of this is, especially for the person whose life is being ended. And so, um, it's a difficult situation, but I think, like what Jason was saying, ultimately, what can the Catholic male do? Well, live according to his faith as best as possible, and the Catholic men have, like Catholic women, have the right to vote, and that's one way to pursue legislation that promotes Catholic uh, view of laws that reflect Catholic values ultimately as best as they can. They're obviously not going to be perfect, but participating in the dominant society is helpful. And so, if Catholics all of a sudden get up and leave the state of New York because the state of New York has abortion laws or a lack of abortion laws or whatever, who's going to be there to help change legislation?
Right. Exactly. And that's being a disciple, right? It's are we looking for the easy way out, or are we looking for the hard way out, right? And I think, Alan, you made a valid point. I think we do this too many times. Well, if I just do this, then I'll be happy. If I just buy that, then I'll be happy. If I date this girl, I'll be happy. And you do it all and you're still not happy. So you have to be happy yourself first, and you have to find grace and joy even in the dark times. And that's what your faith is for. Your faith is to trust that God is there even in the darkest moments, because God is light. God was brought here to shine light on the darkness of of all the craziness that was going on prior to Jesus' birth, right? And so he's conquered darkness, he's conquered death, he's conquered Satan. And keeping that faith, you could get through the darkness of, like what you're saying, Alan, these crazy laws, and help maybe change it. Be involved in your church. Maybe you do religious ed and you teach kids about what abortion is, or pro life and understanding of life. Maybe not abortion, but the importance of life and what life is, and that you are a child of God and you are important to this world, and and your life should be held with the utmost you know like treasure, because you only have one, and you're made by God. And so I just think, to your point, Alan, with the fool's mission, I I agree with you on that, because if it you may not, to your point, you'll find something else that isn't right, and then where do you go?
And that's human nature. We're all
Right.
fallen people in a fallen world. And in this version of the Catechism from 1992 was signed off by John Paul II, and his great encyclical was "Do not be afraid," right? Or crossing the threshold. His big saying was "Do not be afraid." And then part of it, I think, was in crossing the threshold of hope. I don't know. I feel like I'm making mistakes somewhere. Maybe there was different encyclical as well, but there was his constantly reminding people to be hopeful and not to be afraid, and so on. And I think in his papacy, those were core messages that he was sending along. And afterwards we had Benedict XVI, who talked about the culture of death. But it doesn't mean that we should be afraid and that we shouldn't be hopeful, and then Benedict comes out, and his first encyclical is Deus Caritas Est, God is love, and so there is sort of this overflowing of love and hopefulness that as Catholics we can welcome into our lives, no matter what's going on in the secular worlds around us, no matter what's going on in the things outside of which we have any real authority.
Right.
And and of course authority can be lost and forfeited and whatever, and we've got to get on with each other as best as we can, but I think that as a Catholic male, living as a Catholic and voting as a Catholic, and these are the things that we can do, and we can do so hopefully, and we always do so lovingly. That's the idea. If we do it just
Right.
because we're in the pride and self-love, and we want everyone to think the way I think, then we've lost the battle.
Exactly. And look, moving, I also think that one thing that you see about more moderate to conservative states, they're more financially, you know, uh, easier for people to live and buy a house and this and that. So, the affordability is much more. It's not as expensive as the more liberal states such as New York and California because of their high taxes. And so, making a move based on a financial decision, right, is fine. But you would want to go to where, it's more affordable for you, right? And again, you want to discern. You want to go to the place and check it out, right? You want to maybe stay there for a few days, like talk to the locals. Like you're just not going to get up and like, let's move to Idaho, Boise, Idaho, right? And then you go there and you're like, man, why did I move here?
Terrible, yeah.
Yeah, this is terrible, right? So
Right. Plus,
it's all part of
earnings tend to go
discernment.
down as well. So
Right.
Places can be more affordable, but then if you're working out there, presumably the
Right.
salaries will be lower, and so
Right.
and then you're handicapped should you ever wish to come back to a place that has a higher
Right.
standard of living. So
Right.
these are all issues, and life isn't perfect. We've constantly got new bad challenges on our hands the moment we wake up, and
Yeah.
abortion's a pretty clear one. And I think that we can all be thankful for that. At least we know where the church stands, and where we as Catholic men need to look for answers to some of this stuff, and not get caught up in all the nonsense and the talking heads on TV and radio and whatever. We can just look to the magisterium, and there we find some truth in the matter.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Alan.
Alan, I like what you said too about like if all the pro-life people were to leave New York because of the abortion law, then who's left to change it? And
Well, that's it, and and it doesn't mean we all have to be out there protesting or whatever it is. We can do so quietly in the voting booth if we wish
there's a lot of
to do so. Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of. Do you guys remember the book that was really popular like 5 years ago called The Benedict Option
Yes.
by Rod Dreher?
Yes.
It kind of reminds me of that, and I never read the book, but it was so popular that I got a really good idea of what it was all about. It's basically about retreating from society to better protect our values and our Catholic faith and all that stuff. And I remember at the time that left a bad taste in my mouth because I was like, that I don't know, that's kind of a defeatist attitude. It's I to running in contrary to my own point earlier, I guess, is the idea of like, well, shouldn't we be going where the fight is? Shouldn't maybe not necessarily seeking it out, but at least not running away from it either. So those of us who live in places that are, trying to sponsor really pro-abortion bills or whatever, maybe we need.
Yeah, but I think I don't disagree with that. I just think that one of the things is make sure it makes all the sense in the world financially, this, that, and the other thing, because again, the first and foremost priority is your family, right?
Yeah.
If we are in this mindset of like, I got to go there and do this fight, your family may not, it's not your family's fight. And I think it's just, what is the best decision that I can make for my family? And if I'm in a state that's crazy, then, what do I have to do as a parent to keep my kids on the moral, high track? And that's difficult, but that's where, again, we have our faith, we have God, and, we have, to Alan's point, the Catechism, we have prayer. There's plenty of things that, and love, right? Love. If you're a father out there listening, love your children. Love your children. Make sure that they could come to you with anything, because guess what? If you don't love them and you don't show them love, they're going to go somewhere else for love, and that somewhere else may not be where you want them to go.
Right.
And then they could be taught all different things. And because you never gave them the time or loved them or showed them love, doesn't mean you don't love them. Show them love, a hug, a kiss, tuck them in at night, whatever the case may be. Create that bond between your daughter and or your son. That's the most important thing, because then you have this relationship where you could teach them and they will be listening to you because you love them and they know that you love them. And that's the important, I think that's the important part there. Because I feel like I definitely, a lot of these kids that we see out there making a mess, they have divorced parents, the parents, a lot of selfishness, a lot of I. And then the kids are looking for love, and the parents are my career, my this, my that. And the kids go out to the schools and they learn the Marxist agenda, the woe is me, and then they start looting the neighborhoods. And they lose all moral compass. The church is gone, everything is gone. And that's what happens when the family is broken down by simply not loving your family and showing that love.
I want to jump in, guys. I know we might be wrapping up. I don't want to add a revolutionary idea here, or call to arms, but thing to keep in mind when we talk about these bad situations in different states, like politically, there's a handful of states. There's 4 states that voluntarily fund abortion through taxpayer dollars. So, their legislators voluntarily voted. These people were elected, and that's only the case for a handful of states. There's like 4. I actually have got it pulled up. It's Maryland, Hawaii, New York, and Washington State. And so in Maryland, $6.5 million annually go to elective abortion through Medicaid reimbursement. So if you live in a place like that, that is your taxpayer dollars,
right?
And that large sum right there going to that. Now you might say, well, that's just a drop in the bucket when it comes to state money and everything and spending, but that's a massive amount. So it is worth paying attention, knowing your state's laws, knowing what's going on. And then I'm not saying up and leave, but I think it does, everything in prayer. If you are going to be there, the question is, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
That doesn't mean leave, but like whether it's protest, whether it's helping out, like you guys have mentioned in different ways at a home for women in crisis pregnancies, whatever. And then I'll just leave with this super radical thing. What if you just don't pay taxes?
Yeah, well, I would love that. I mean, if we just go back to what our founding fathers established, I mean, that would be taxation as it pertains to income tax.
Yeah, I wonder if we could just claim like, hey, this government doesn't represent me or my values, so therefore I will not pay taxes.
I mean, there are other issues out there where people are protesting and saying their taxpayer dollars shouldn't go to something, including issues like abortion. So I'm not saying don't pay taxes, but let's just leave that
I think
question on the table.
Right. I think those are all good valid points of like things that, understanding, like you said, understanding what the state you live in, what are they spending their tax dollars on. And the one thing about that with the tax dollars, right? All this government assistance and this and that. The Catholic Church does the utmost unbelievable job as it pertains, and with dignity and respect, and gives the person hope to get back on their feet when it comes to these social issues. Okay? Because they give the person dignity, and they don't keep people on this assistance and on this stuff to live a not so great life. Okay, so if we shrunk the size of government and stop paying taxes to all these bloated salaries and say it's going to this and going to that, when it really doesn't, it just goes to the government's bloated salaries, and allow the churches, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, whatever have you, Christian, allow the churches to do what the churches do best, and that service society, all of this wouldn't be a problem.
I agree. Yeah.
So I
Absolutely
think
agree.
to round it up, because it's almost 10 o'clock, to round it up,
Pay
I
your
think
taxes.
yeah,
For now.
to round, Not, by no means are we telling you not to pay your taxes.
It's a good idea to pay your taxes.
It's a good idea to pay your
Well,
taxes. Yes. But to summarize, there's a couple of things that you could do. I think this is an interesting topic, because we're seeing it more and more and more as these immoral things are becoming, spotlighted, and around not just federally, but statewide. It is important to be, first of all, to have the knowledge, to understand what's going on, educate yourself on both sides, just so you have both, so you understand both sides. Very important to understand both sides, because if you just know your side, you're not going to be able to really understand what the other person is saying, and then that's when arguments start. So educate yourself on both sides. Stand firm with your faith. And as for the men out there, love your family. This battle starts in the home. Drew, to your point, the little church, which is at home, and discern and pray. Talk to your spouse, talk to your children, pray, get spiritual guidance. If you see a therapist, talk to your therapist about it. Don't make a decision based on emotion. Make sure you're making a decision that is God's will, and so that wherever you end up, you're going to live in joy and peace and harmony, regardless of what disasters are going on around you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that exhortation is a great way to close us out here tonight. So I'll just, unless anyone has anything else they want to add really quick.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. All right. Well, then I'll just say with that, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hopefully you came away with something to think about at the very least. And I want to say, if you like what we're doing here, click subscribe or follow or whatever the button might say to stay in tune with whatever we're dropping month to month. And if you want to give us some feedback too, there's probably comments in your respective podcast platform that you can leave us. We just want to say thanks for listening, and St. Joseph, pray for us.